It's Weird Wednesday.
What?
Bob's back.
Yeah, he's a looker.
When we logged on to the video, Tori literally was startled by him.
Yeah, because he actually looks like a human being behind you.
Well, this may be Bob's last week in the podcast because I'm thinking about moving him downstairs. So you may not see him again. Maybe.
R.I.P.
He'll still live. He'll live on.
What about all the outfits that you picked?
I know. So what's weird this week?
Well, mine is more on like a not more of a funny. I kind of feel like I need to balance it out, you know?
Yeah.
So we are in the middle of probably one of the craziest, busiest seasons of life. And I woke up this morning. Let's just say I bought these vitamin supplements that are supposed to help you sleep. I didn't go to bed till 1:30 a.m. So I don't think they work. Actually, I do, because when I did finally fall asleep, I wasn't tossing and turning like I usually do. I was out.
Oh, wow.
But I woke up early because I have children and was just extremely overwhelmed with life and all the things that are on my plate. And hopefully this resonates with everybody because it's just really overwhelming sometimes. And
Mhm.
so I was spending time with the Lord this morning and asked him to just minister to my heart because it was getting to the point where it makes me wanna just not do anything at all, just because there's just so much to do that my reactions are always to just hide in my shell, read a book, or just, not do any of the responsibilities that I have. So,
Mhm.
I was reading in my normal places that I'm in right now, and I felt like the Lord said, "Hey, you need to read today's proverb." And I was like, "Okay, Lord." So, of course, it's the third. So I read Proverbs 3. And I mean, we know this verse, but just think of this verse in what I told you. Your life is chaotic. Everything is going crazy. You feel like you can't grasp anything. You're out of control and you're worried. And Proverbs 3, 5, 6 through 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways, know him, and he will make your paths straight." And why that's quote unquote weird is because this is the verse we've been teaching our son the last 3 weeks.
Mm.
And so every day, at least this whole week, he has been saying it out loud to himself while he's playing because we made kind of like a little beat to it. So now it's like this little rap song that he has. But I've been hearing it all week long and it never hit me. It was just kind of the thought of this is my son's Bible verse that he's memorizing,
Mhm.
and you kind of
Mhm.
lose what the words are. And I read that and I was like, okay, Lord, I hear you. I felt like God was saying, you've been hearing this all week long and you're still worried. You're still stressed out. I've been telling you all week long, trust in me with all of your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding.
Mhm.
Acknowledge me in all your ways and I will direct your path.
Yeah.
I was just really blessed by that. So sometimes the Lord has to really hit me in the head with it because I could be pretty stubborn. So
I'm pretty sure everyone listening can relate to that story in that sentiment that sometimes, Lord, we just really need you to be obvious about it.
yes, and he was, but that was my what was weird.
I love that. I love that. So, my something weird came up in a conversation with one of my brothers. I'll call him my twin brother because he's the one closest in age to me, and I think we're the most similar personality-wise, temperament-wise, the things that we like to talk about and learn about. And yesterday we were talking about frequencies and
Mm.
kind of ancient technology, and he told me something. You guys may have already heard about it. I heard about it for the first time. It's called the Baghdad battery. Have you heard of that?
No, I'm assuming it has something to do with the military.
Well, it's called Baghdad because it was found in Iran
Oh,
in,
okay.
I think it was 1936 or 1938. And it's dated back to around 200 BC. And what it is it's this little clay pot. I saw a picture of someone actually holding it like in the palm of their hand. It's only 5 inches tall, 3 inches wide. And inside, I need to grab my notes for this. Inside, there is a cylindrical tube of copper, and there's an iron rod inside, and then something kind of like black tar. It was the residue they found, and it was kind of acidic.
Mhm.
And so after they had this finding, they replicated what they had found because there were 3 jars lined up next to each other, but only one of them had all these components inside. So they replicated it and they discovered that it could be used as a battery. It produced electric voltage.
Whoa, like the first ever battery, really?
So, I mean, maybe the first ever, but the oldest discovered battery. And it was really interesting to me because I ended up watching several videos, just wanting people's different opinions about it.
Naturally.
And it's funny because some of the archaeologists that briefly touched on it are really resistant to acknowledging that it's possible that they had this sort of technology back then. Even though it had been tested, I mean, even though the components all match up and it's right in their face, but it just kind of reminded me of this hesitance to believe that our ancestors were capable of producing this kind of technology, right?
Mhm.
We're the ones who came up with this in the last century versus them having access to similar things in the past. And it actually plays perfectly into today's topic of the Nephilim because, AKA the Watchers, because according to the Book of Enoch, they're the ones who shared a lot of the knowledge with us. And we'll go into that more later. Another thought that I had with these types of discoveries, so my brother and I, we also spoke about the pyramids and how, number one, no one's ever gotten to the bottom of them, right? We don't know how deep they go. There's also a lot of speculation about what they were used for. One of the speculations is that they were used for a power source utilizing the stars, the moon, the sun, things like that, which also come from the Watchers. And part of me wondered if they're buried for a reason, you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
because as tall as people are speculating they are, meaning how deep into the earth that they go, it must have taken so much to bury those things.
Well, there's
So
speculation of how they were built too, and by whom.
right, right. And so part of me is wondering, if this knowledge that the Nephilim shared with us, and I'm getting really far ahead. This is something that maybe I should have said on the back end. But if this is knowledge that the Nephilim shared with us that we weren't meant to know, maybe it's God's grace that these things were lost. The ancient technology, as fascinating as it is, perhaps it's his grace and his mercy that they're lost to us, you
Mm.
know?
Like it
So
wasn't their time yet in a way.
right, and
Mhm.
that they weren't to share those things with us. So today we wanted to get into a topic that, I'll be honest, I everything that I know about this story, I did not learn in a church setting.
Me neither, yeah. I don't think
I
I've heard the Nephilim mentioned once in church.
Yeah, not to say that there aren't churches out there who will
Mhm.
touch on this subject because I think there are. I just believe that they're very few and far between. What I
Mhm.
know, I've learned from people like Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Chuck Missler, and others
Mhm.
who, share this information with us. But what I do believe very strongly is that having a foundation or having an understanding of Genesis 6 is pretty foundational to understanding the Old Testament as well
Mhm.
as some prophecies.
Mhm.
And what I equate it to in my mind is, can you imagine going through the Old Testament into the New Testament without a foundational knowledge of God's covenant with Abraham or the tabernacle or sacrifices? Once I learned about the Nephilim, I kind of started to view it in the same light. Like there
Mhm.
was so much I was missing in my studies because I didn't know what Genesis 6 meant.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it brings because Genesis 6 is not the only time that the Nephilim or giants are mentioned. And so knowing who they are, where they came from, and why they're significant even creates a better understanding of I think of scriptures in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, in Jude, how they talk about why the sons of God are chained and why they even have that punishment.
Mhm,
I knew those things before, but I never knew why. It was
mhm,
kind of just this underlying idea of, well, they were bad, they sinned against God or they went against God, and now they're in eternal damnation. And that's
mhm,
as far as it went. But
mhm.
understanding why, I mean, it's a way bigger deal. No wonder they're in so much trouble.
Truly, truly. So let's go to Genesis 6. I'm going to read verses 1 through 8. And it says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And I don't know about you, Tori, but my whole understanding of the Genesis 6 account came from verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And if that were the only premise for what happened, gosh, we would constantly be in trouble because
Right. That was the first question I had thinking back to, Sunday school when, oh, they had to flood the earth because everyone was just so bad.
Mhm,
What's different from today? I would argue that maybe it's worse. How
right.
come that hasn't happened again? If that really was just it.
Mhm.
I mean, it couldn't be.
So I wanted to go back to the first and second verse. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. One of the theories about this verse is that the sons of God are the sons of Seth, and that the women are the sons of Cain. And that one of the reasons the flood happened is because supposedly they weren't supposed to breed with one another. Well, just right off the bat in verse 1 and 2, that term, sons of God, is B'nai Ha-Elohim. It's also used in Job, Luke, the Book of Enoch, and the Septuagint. But what that term means is some a being that was directly created by God's hand. So that would be the B'nai Ha-Elohim, which are the sons of God, the heavenly beings, most commonly referred to as angels, and that also includes Adam. So
Mhm.
he's a son of God. We, those of us who are born by natural processes here on earth, we're sons
Mhm.
of Adam. Right off the bat, one way that these are beings created by the hand of God. And
Mhm.
then further down in verse 4 where it says Nephilim, Nephilim means the fallen ones, and it comes from the root word of nephat, which is to fall, to be cast down, to fall away, or to desert. And in the Greek, it's translated into gigantes, which some Bible translations will just call them giants. Um, but the root word is gigas, which is earthborn. The word is also used because it's Greek, it's also used to describe demigods in Greek mythology, which when I first learned about the Nephilim, I started also learning, just like all cultures have a flood story,
Mhm.
ancient civilizations, there's always a flood story. There's also stories about the Nephilim. And I kid you not, one of the first thoughts I had was, "Oh my gosh, what if Greek mythology is real?" What if
Mhm.
it's actually a history? Because think about it, there are the sons of God. So there's the main lower, gods, Zeus,
Mhm.
Poseidon, them. But then they also breed with women and then create their children, the demigods. And
Mhm.
that's literally a reflection of what is happening in Genesis 6.
Mhm.
So this was a really weird thought, and it was kind of creepy to me when I first started learning about it. Just the thought that there were hybrids on the earth. It was just such a foreign concept to me at the time when I first
Mhm.
learned about this. Do you remember feeling like that at all?
A part of me was questioning everything at that point, and not in terms of my faith, but what else is out there.
Mhm,
And like you said, these things that we've heard or watched even as children in Disney, and how where did these stories come from? How did where was this originated really? And
mhm,
I felt like, if you look back at a lot of history or philosophy and things like that, astrology, all of that, it always ties into some kind of story that I remember from growing up, and I feel like they're all connected in some way, and I wonder if it's to kind of
they, like, acclimate us to these ideas.
yes, and they
Mhm,
become fantastical, and they're just stories, they're nothing more than that. But then my first thought when I learned about the Nephilim and who they are, and then you kind of connect that to, well, that makes sense because David literally fought a giant. Where would the giant come from? Would he be the only one?
right.
No. And then you read in Job and about Leviathan and the behemoth and just all these different large, crazy creatures that you
Mhm.
just kind of skip over or you don't even go there. And then now I'm like, what else?
And to me, it makes sense because if you
Mhm.
think about it, so in Genesis 3, a Messiah is promised, right? Through the bloodline of man. And so it makes
Mhm.
sense to me that these fallen angels would come down. And I'm actually going to read a portion of the book of Enoch where they have this conversation. But it makes sense to me that they would come down and try to taint the human bloodline. And
Mhm.
it's as though they almost succeeded because
Mhm.
it had touched all the people of the earth. So in the book of Enoch, it talks about the watchers having this conversation about come let us choose wives for ourselves from among the children of men and have children. And then it talks about kind of their leadership, but there's a group of 200 of them who agree to do this. And they even say, um, Indeed, I fear you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone will have to pay the penalty of this great sin. So they knew that what they were about to do was a defilement and that they would receive a punishment. And it says, let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves to mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan to do this thing. And of course, we know that they didn't abandon the plan because we read that in chapter 6. But what I wanted to read in relation to something that you had said earlier about the animals and whatnot, in chapter 7, it talks about, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and they started to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. So it's just this idea that the Nephilim that were born became so gruesome. And what this text is sharing is that they were talking about the Nephilim in that verse, by the way. So the sons of God came down, they bred, and then the Nephilim are the ones who became gruesome. And it says that they turned against humans because humans could no longer provide for their appetites, basically. And so they started
Mm,
attacking all the flesh of the earth. And
mm.
so it's as though the flood is twofold, right? The Lord needed to get rid of this tainted blood, but also, gosh, to save us from these giants, right?
I just wanted to share in agreement with what you're saying, that the Nephilim were becoming so monster-like at this point.
Mhm,
In Deuteronomy 2:11, it says, "They were also regarded as giants like the Anakim, but the Moabites call them Anim, and Anim means terrors."
mhm,
And they also had every people group had a different name for them, but they all alluded to, like, terror. One of them was evil planners, one of them were, like, you which or, like, plotters,
mhm,
um, and so they were always known as that,
mhm.
as these evil monsters, terror, plotters, like evil plotters and things like that.
Wow. Which, thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord, for wiping them out. Going back to Genesis 6 and asking why Noah, right? So in verse 9, it says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And that word for blameless, um, some translations say he was perfect, and which, depending on your translation, but the word there is tamim, and it always refers, when it's used, it always refers to a physical blemish. So it means he was without blemish. He was sound, healthful, without spot, unimpaired, which translates to Noah's bloodline not being tainted. And it says it right there in black and white.
Hmm.
I like how you said that with some sass. You're like, "Hmm."
I mean, shout out to Noah, thank you for
You know?
for not falling into that temptation.
Mhm.
So
So
my question too is for you, talking about bloodlines, do you think that that's where a lot of these bloodlines come from? These the
the Nephilim,
mhm.
the iniquities?
Like yeah, mhm,
That's a really interesting question. I do believe that the Nephilim are still active. Well, I know that they are because of personal accounts of survivors. So the bloodlines that you're referring to, I think you're referring to like the 13 bloodlines.
mhm,
We know that they are who they are because of the iniquity in their blood, not because they're rich, not because
mm-mm,
they're born into this name or whatever the case may be. They are rich because of the bloodline itself, and they're in a place of power because they've been used by basically evil forces. And
mhm,
so I according to the accounts that we've heard, I believe that the Nephilim are the ones instilling the iniquity in the blood because of the abuse that they've done, and the further along the generations come, the deeper the iniquity and the more power that they can gain from those spiritual forces, if that makes sense. And so, to answer your question, one way or another, I believe the Nephilim do have a hand in those bloodlines and utilizing them to this day to
Yeah, but whether or not they came from then or now is we're not really sure, but they have
Mhm.
something to do with it from this day. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I feel like I would have to read into that more. As we know, the Lord always makes confirmations, even just within his word 2 to 3 times. And so I wanted to share a couple more verses in relation to the Nephilim. The first one is they're both in the New Testament. One of them is Jude, verses 6 and 7. And it says, "And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains and under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." And then the second one, 2 Peter 2:4 through 5. And it says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly." It's interesting to me as well that in both mentions of the Nephilim, or excuse me, of the sons of God and how they were punished and chained, it's interesting that in both references, they also mention Sodom and Gomorrah and the evil that was being
Mhm.
done there.
My husband made the same correlation
Mhm.
because of what Sodom and Gomorrah was.
Right. And for in both cases, this un unnatural desires. In addition to that, in 2 Peter 2, it also mentions in some translations, it's Tartarus. In mine, it said hell, but it's the Greek word for dark abode, a pit of darkness in the unseen world. And what's really interesting is in Homer's Iliad, he says that Tartarus is as far below Hades as earth is below heaven. And I just found
Mm,
that really interesting because it's almost, geographical, like pinpointing it geographically. Not that
mhm.
we know how far
Right.
below Earth is from heaven, but that there's a sort of measurement to determine that really fascinated me. And
Mhm.
again, going back to the Greeks, we read about these philosophers and, Homer being a playwright and things like that. And I just am curious how much of that is historical fact versus
Mm,
mythology,
mhm.
I just a question I have.
Yeah, I was thinking about also the questions that kinda came to my mind when I was kinda going through this again were, are they still around? If so, how? I mean, we know in Genesis 6 it says that they were before the flood and after,
Mhm,
but my question is, in what way?
mhm,
Is it physically? Is it their spirit that have, manifested itself in different beings or people, whatever it may be? Um, Also, do these beings, these Nephilim, interbreed with other types of beasts or animals or things like that?
well, one of the questions that I don't know that we've spoken it on the podcast, but definitely you and I have talked about privately is, obviously we talk about cryptid things on here, and could it be a origin point for Bigfoot? We
Mhm.
had asked, because the Nephilim were known to give themselves over, what it says, and they began to sin against animals. Could that sin against animals have potentially created these cryptids that
Right, like Dog Man.
Right, dog man, Bigfoot, and the reason that would seem plausible to me is because in a lot of accounts, Bigfoot and dogman, but mainly Bigfoot, seem to do supernatural things. Some people attribute it to, you know, portals maybe being able to appear and disappear, but a lot of accounts describe them as having a strong sense of, like, spirit, like, evil within
Mhm,
them, and
mhm,
even the descriptions of them being terrors, the Nephilim, I can see how that would apply to some Bigfoot accounts as well, so it's a
mhm.
super interesting thought that some of these cryptids potentially came from came from that, and, along with that is, um, Native Americans again, have stories of they mention star people or visitors from the stars. And here's a really weird fact is so Nephilim were believed to have 6 fingers, and because of that, the Native Americans were afraid of the six-fingered people, and that's where that, raised hand greeting came from, to show one another that they only had 5 digits as opposed to
Mm.
6. Isn't that
Interesting.
isn't that wild?
Wow. That reminds me of an article that I had found when I was kind of diving into this topic. One of the only ones that were kinda left in the archives was from Wisconsin, out of all places.
Mm,
And from May 1912, there were a group of people, I wanna say miners or something like that, who were digging deep, deep, deep into the earth and found bones. And
mm.
but they were like a grave site, and the grave site had a stone on the side. So the picture was the stone on the side and then the skeleton, and on the stone that it was laying beside had ancient native paintings of these giant beings with the 6 hands and 6 toes. And the skeleton that laid beside it matched what the painting was.
That does not surprise me whatsoever.
Right? But then I thought about, because 'cause I'm also so in college, we're the one of the classes that I'm in, we're learning a lot about the Native Americans,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of tribes that were all forced into specific reservations, and I also wanna say, I feel like the only reason why they allowed that article to stay available is because they attribute it to evidence for Darwinism,
Mm.
because the skulls were very human-like, but disproportional, as in much larger, not having the right amount of fingers and toes, and so obviously that means we evolved as human beings.
Like, we figured out we didn't need 6 fingers anymore or 6 digits anymore, so we just lost one along the
And
way.
we don't have to be like a huge amount of feet tall, so we just shrunk out of nowhere over time.
Mhm. Well, I remember growing up, one of the theories was shorter people are from hot climates and taller people are from cold climate. I also have an account I wanted to read. It's from the Pawnee Indians. I believe they were Midwestern, like a tribe in the Midwest. And this account is from Colonel William Cody, and it's from 1920. It says, while we were in the sand hills scouting the Niobrara country, the Pawnee Indians brought into camp some very large bones, one of which the surgeon to the expedition pronounced to be the thigh bone of a human being. The Indians said the bones were those of a race of people who long ago had lived in that country. They said these people were 3 times the size of a man of the present day, that they were so swift and strong that they could run by the side of a buffalo and, taking the animal in one arm, could tear off a leg and eat it as they ran. And it gives just this perspective of how, they were grasshoppers They said they were the size of
Right.
grasshoppers
Mhm.
among these giants.
Mhm. That is terrifying.
Isn't it? A buffalo.
Those buffalo, just look up a buffalo. They're huge.
They are
Very
giant.
dense.
Yes. Yes. And to just be able to run and grab one and start snacking on a leg, that's I'm sad that our like Spotify and Apple Podcast listeners can't see the face you just made.
Ugh. I just the thought. That's brutal. Could you imagine witnessing that yourselves? Because the Pawnee are writing because they must have seen that themselves, these
Mhm.
beings doing that. I would be
Yeah.
terrified. Well, I was gonna say, the west side where we lived, Pacific Northwest, was one of the later places to be colonized. And there is allegedly, if there's footage, you can look online of what they call the giant door in Oregon.
Mhm.
And if they come around and you look in the mountain, it looks like a giant door.
Mhm.
And I just think of all these different types of places or things that they've seen that are still around allegedly, and
Mhm.
how a lot of it is on here, the west side, versus I don't really hear much on the east side. Do you think that that's correlates at all to having a lot of the reservations and stuff like that are still over here versus
Mhm. So, in it's really interesting connection with national parks, reservations, and some of these things. There's this I don't know how many of you have heard of Thomas Horn, but he and his team had been or investigating portals, and he found that the majority of the portals that they found were always in caves, and they were almost always on a reservation. And furthermore, when they approached these portals, they were almost always met with military force.
Hmm.
Soldiers with guns would come out and stop them from going further, which just right now, spur of the moment, I had this thought of perhaps this is why they saw it necessary to kind of suffocate the Native American people and their culture, because in order to usher in this very, gosh, I don't even know what I would call it, but this way of thinking, this Western belief system, they needed to suffocate the truth of the history of this land, which, as we keep finding, the more topics we talk about, there's always a Native American equivalent, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And they hold so faithfully to their stories and their beliefs of what happened, whereas, Western culture works really hard to discount any of those histories with evolution and science,
Mhm.
right? And they're
Mhm.
the ones who are viewed as being mystical and crazy. Not that there aren't, witch doctors or shamans or things like that. However, they have these accounts that align so well with the Bible. And I think we talked about that a few podcasts ago, which is why it was easy for some tribes to convert to Christianity, because their histories already lined up with what missionaries were sharing about God's word.
Mhm.
So, isn't that's just a thought that I had. What do you think about that? I mean,
Well, what's interesting is I just learned, so I live on a reservation, and part of what been learning about in one of my English classes is the history of the Nez Perce
mm,
and this reservation. And the Nez Perce tribe, the reason why they came to this area and the reason why they were given this place as a reservation was because a reverend saved them, like, they became believers,
wow.
and it was because a lot of what they already believed in their own culture and their own spiritual type of, I guess, religion
Mhm.
lined up with what the reverend here in this area was telling them. And so they were more susceptible to moving their bands to this area because they of this familiarity within their beliefs.
And that's so beautiful to me that they have these stories that recognize God's hand, but those the word of the gospel just hadn't gotten to them yet,
Mhm.
you know?
Mm.
It's
I also
almost
think about your whole portal thing. I was just watching this thing. We're kinda jumping all over the place,
we
but
are. That's okay.
I'm trying to tie all of what you were saying to just different things I've been reading the last couple week or this last week. I also watched this, thing about Mount Hermon and how
Mm.
they found
Yes, you're right. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I'm glad you brought up Mount Hermon. That's believed to be the place where the Nephilim, or excuse me, the sons of God descended on,
Mhm.
and they believe that there's kind of a location on the mountain where sacrifices were likely made and may also be a portal.
Yes,
And
okay, a
with
portal, that's what I thought.
with one of the accounts that you and I have both heard, her name's well, her the name that she's using is Elle, and she's a survivor of satanic ritual abuse. But some of the rituals that were done on her were at Mount Hermon. And interesting fact, when I was in Israel, we were in one of the places we visited were the foothills around Mount Hermon. And one of the things, this was a decade ago, so I didn't know nearly as much about Mount Hermon and all of this as I do now. However, I can tell you very distinctly that there was a heaviness in that region. There was
Mm,
just a spiritual weight that I hadn't felt anywhere else. It was completely opposite of what I felt in the Galilee region and then even in Jerusalem. But out there, it really did feel heavy, might I say evil, but definitely heavy. And
mm.
so and there's a UN base on Mount Hermon,
So
which
that's
the
where I was going with it, was that
Mhm.
the UN base was put there, and there's no they do not allow at all any kind of archaeological
So sus,
digging,
guys.
right?
So sus.
Any kind of experimenting or things like that. You have to be the top elite in that government to be able to have access to that area.
And
Why?
were we not just talking about the UN and the Bluebeam episode and how they have a hand in everything that's happening? Man, it's
Mhm.
right in our faces, I'm telling you.
I just wanted to say, you know, I will say when I first heard of these things, and I don't know about you as a listener, if you've even heard of the Nephilim, if this has even been touched on in any of your types of studies, but it can be kind of scary. It can feel overwhelming thinking about these hybrid beasts that have roamed and could potentially still be in some aspect today, or even just with Project Bluebeam and, what's to come, and maybe you dove into that blizzard of revelation and are a little a little on the fearful side, which I just want to say I feel is normal. It's a
Mhm,
lot of information, and it's a lot to kind of wrap your mind around, and you're not alone.
mhm.
But I wanted to encourage everybody with a couple of these verses. I'm in Job right now in my own personal study, and it was I was reading chapters 40 and 41, and it's the Lord talking to Job and reminding him of who he is and his power, how big he is, how who are you to question who I am? Can you do these things, versus like that what I can do versus what you can do, and why I am the Lord and you're not. And he also starts talking about these beasts like Behemoth and Leviathan, and it says in Job 40:19, he, Behemoth, is the foremost of God's works. Only his maker can draw the sword against him. And Behemoth was, they say, even potentially a dinosaur-like creature, like a long neck, if you think of the Bronchiosaurus, I think that's how you pronounce that. But those types of creatures, if you think of these massive beings, like they said his legs were like chunks of cedar. They're huge beings that a human being could not even touch. But then in Isaiah 27:1, so he also, in Job, also goes into Leviathan, which is like the sea monster, a dragon-like being. You can look that up online. They're pretty scary looking. But in Isaiah 27:1, it says, "On that day, the Lord with his relentless, large, strong sword will bring judgment on Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the monster that is in the sea." And I wanted to read that because for me, it tied in with what the Lord said in Job, how he's the only one that can slay these beings, and how in Isaiah it says and prophesies that he will and has. You know, we read in Revelation how he will slay this beast. And I just want to encourage everybody and myself and you that he's already won. He has the power to slay these beasts. They are nothing compared to him. You even think of the demons who were cast out. They knew what the sons of God's punishment is, where they're at, the internal damnation that they're experiencing in hell. And they didn't even want that. They said, "Put us in the pigs," and then, ran off the cliff and died. Like, they would have rather suffered in that way than what they knew God's judgment can give them. And so I just think about that, hold on to that God is far greater and more powerful than these beings. And there's nothing to be afraid of, because when we're on this side of it, there's already victory.
Amen. In line with God's promises, and not only does he defeat these evil forces. The verse that came to me that was really encouraging is in John 1, and it's verse 11. So in John 1, starting at verse 11, it says, "He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." And this verse is so beautiful to me in relation to this topic, because that word, to become children of God, it's the same one, B'nai Ha-Elohim. And
Mm,
in chapter 3, we know that when we accept Jesus, we are a new creation. There is something that happens within us. There is an actual spiritual shift.
mhm,
And we will not be of blood or the will of flesh, but we will be children of God,
mm,
molded by him. And I was like, wow, Lord, that is so beautiful. And that's
mm,
true of all of us who believe in him.
mhm,
Again, we hope that you guys took something away from this, that if anything, it prompts you to dig deeper in the word. And like Tori said earlier, maybe you'd already heard of the Nephilim. Maybe this hybrid idea is completely new to you. Either way, God is in control, and we get to be his children.
mm,
The reason that Jesus did all of this in the first place.
mm.
So stay curious, guys.
And stay weird.